Today let's talk about development and management. And here we want to first talk about the entire process of development, and then we want to move on to discuss operation. Operation is the daily management of the property after the property is completed and is built. And let's go on to the next slide. And here we talk about the occasion for development. And there are three possible scenarios. The first scenario is a use in search of a site. So here we have looking for a space for one particular purpose, maybe an educational purpose. And then we want to look for a site to build such a space. Like, for example, the need for a new school. We identify a site and we build a school for it. And another situation is that a site in search of a use. Let's assume that you are the owner of one particular lot. And you're thinking about that, how would be able to add value to my property in terms of what kind of the property that I will be able to, permanent structure that I will be able to design and build. Am I thinking about want to build a hotel here, or am I want to build an office building here? That would be the situation in terms of the site in search of a use. Another possible scenario is that resources in search of an opportunity. For example, let's assume that you are an endowment fund. You're thinking about you want to invest 10% of your endowment onto the real estate. So you may think about that, how am I going to allocate this pot of money to development or to establish property? That would be resources in search of an opportunity. In this case, an opportunity for development. Next slide. And here we have 8 stages of the development, starting with first establishing site control. We will talk about those step one at a time later. And then the second step is feasibility analysis. And here feasibility have 2 different dimensions. One is the financial feasibility. That means that whether this development makes sense in a financial sense. And then the other feasibility is a more physical one, relating to the soil strength, etc., and environmental impact, etc. We will talk about that later. And then when you want to develop something, you want to build something, you will need to have a permit from local government. So the third step is to go through that process to have the permit. And then you have, during this process also you need to have a design. And the designs of this particular development. And then we will need to have financing. That would be the source of the capital to make this project a possibility. And then once we have the necessary financing, then we go along to the construction. And then once the property is almost finished or is finished, then we will need to market the space, and then we will need to the tenants to start moving through the leasing activity. And then we move on to the final stage of operation after this property is permitted to have the tenant moving. So let's take a look. We have this timeline in the next slide. And as you can see that although they are kind of stepped from the very beginning to the end, but they are not entirely sequential in the sense that there are a lot of overlapping, okay, from one step to the other. Sometimes we even have a loop. We'll go to the next stage and then we find some problem. We may come back to the previous stage, revise the previous stage, and then move on. So it's not entirely a sequential one. Let's go on to the next slide. The first step, let's talk about site control. There are various ways of site control. Site control means that you have the right to develop this particular project. And the owning this right, okay, the easiest way is simply purchase the land. Once you purchase the land, you have a right to do anything to the land as long as it's permitted by the local government. But buying the land outright is not the only way to secure site control. And site control could be obtained through various strategies as well. And also, site control sometimes involving assembly of land, in the sense that some of the project those are huge projects, require you obtain multiple lots, put them all together in order to have enough of the land to build this big project, something like a Disney World, for example, in Florida or in Shanghai, etc. And those require that the entrepreneur to spend a lot of time to assemble those land. And during this process, secrecy is often a very important thing, because you do not want to leak out your intention, and for an obvious reason of a holdout. And if someone know about, if one of the lot, the owner of one of the lot know about your intention, and that the owner have the interest to hold out and ask for a really high price for his or her land, because he or she know that they have the tremendous amount of bargaining power. Okay, so site control and holdout is often an issue for a big project investing. And let's take a look at the next slide. This is one example of a holdout in China. And this is a project for building a shopping mall. And one of the existing lot owner refused to sell the land at the price that they think that is not good enough. Therefore, you have this kind of ugly holdout. And of course, this kind of situation to this extreme will not occur in the United States. But the logic remains the same. So this is one example of holdout in China. Next slide. And also, assembly of land often create economy scale to take on a highly valuable project. And the Christ family in Seattle is a big family. They own quite a lot of the land in downtown Seattle. And they have been doing so for more than 100 years to put 13 acres of the best spot of the land in downtown Seattle. And once they finish that assembly, then they expect that they will be able to sell at a really good price, because it's very hard to combine with such large scale of the development. Next slide. In addition to purchase the land outright, there are two popular site control strategies. The first one is the use of option. Option means that you don't have to spend all the time to purchase the land. You just put down a small fraction as the price, the premium for this particular option to acquire this land in the next few years. For example, once you acquire all the necessary permit, then you go ahead and purchase the land at a pre-specified price. By doing so, you reduce quite a lot of the equity risk of not being able to develop, and if your project is not fully permitted, and you only pay a small fraction of that. Okay, so the purchase of option from the existing landowner and is one way to reduce this kind of development and permitting risk particularly. Another popular strategy is the use of joint venture. Joint venture just means that developer team up with the landowner. Say that let's do this project together, and the landowner contribute the land to this entire project. In return, get certain percentage of the share of this entire project. And by doing so, that the risk to the developer could be mitigated, because the developer doesn't have to purchase this particular piece of lot. But the downside is that you share a certain fraction of your entire enterprise with the landowner, because landowner provide a tremendous amount of resources and reduce quite a lot of risk for this development as well. Next slide. The second stage is about feasibility. The most important feasibility from a developer perspective is financial feasibility. That means that whether this project has a positive NPV. And we learn in Bsad 180, etc. We know that no, we will take on an investment project only if the NPV is non-negative. That means that we have value taking on this new project. So that's a financial feasibility. And there is another layer of feasibility associated with development that would be the physical feasibility. For example, environmental feasibility, whether the environment of this particular lot is permissible for our intended development. And then, for example, the soil test, whether the soil and underground situation it has enough of a foundation for our structure. If our structure is very, very tall, and then we may need to have a strong foundation. Does this particular location have such strong underground foundation? That would be something that the engineer would figure out. So those are the kind of physical feasibility that the developer will need to go through in order to assess whether our intended development and use is permissible in this particular lot. And the third step is, once we go through this feasibility that financially makes sense and is physically permissible, then we will need to have the permit from local government. And permitting is a very difficult process, in the sense that there are a series of the hurdles that the developer will need to go through. For example, there is a site plan review. In this site plan review, the developer along with the architect is going to present in how this particular piece of land would get used and for what kind of development. For example, the height of the permanent structure, the size of the permanent structure, the look of the permanent structure, etc. And the neighbors and the city official, they would attend this review, and then most likely that some of them is going to oppose to this particular development. Therefore, developer is often the case of very good negotiator and a very good communicator. Would be able to convince the neighbor, the city, that this is a right project for this city at this particular point of time. And so site plan review to convince the local stakeholder is a very important thing for getting the kind of permit that you want to have. And also sometimes you are bounded by the law that you will need to submit regional and environmental impact review. For example, if you want to build a new Walmart in any town, then you will need to have a traffic impact report to be represented to the city, and then to have the green light. And because, as you can imagine, that when you build a big box, Walmart, you're going to bring a lot of traffic to this neighborhood, and the neighbor may not like it. The neighbor want to know that what kind of daily hassle they will need to go through. So a traffic and environmental report is often required for large-scale development. And also sometimes this kind of a meeting process involving zoning change. That means that for some big project and the developer wanted to be able to do something that is outside the scope of the current zoning limit. And one example would be in the next slide. In the next slide, we have news from Burlington Free Place in 2016 involving the Burlington Town Center, our downtown redevelopment project. In that year, there were two ballots on for the city resident to vote. One is number 3, one is number 4, and number 3 allow the developer to would be able to build more and build a taller building than otherwise would be. And the ballot number 4 is about the use of the tax money to subsidize this particular development, and both were passed by the city resident in that year. And so this is a special zoning approval for a big project. Next slide. And here we have the hurdle in terms of permitting is often the case that tremendous. For example, for our downtown shopping mall permitting process, it took about 4 to 5 years. It took entire 4 to 5 years to get this project to get permitted, and still today we haven't seen that thing being built yet. So it's a difficult process, and often the case that people are talking about NIMBY that will be not in my backyard. No, neighbor usually will not like the development too close to their home. And banana will be built absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. They just don't want the thing to get built. They don't like the change to the city, to the look, and any kind of inconvenience. So those are kind of hurdles that the developers need to deal with. Next slide. And once you have the permit, then you'll be able to actually build something, but you will need to have a plan how to do it, and those kind of design issue. Often the case during the permitting process, you already need to have design, because neighbors want to know that what is the design look like. They often contribute to the revision of the design because they have demand. Local resident often has tons of demand. So the designs of a big project usually would get revised many times during a long period of time of the permitting process. And in this process, there are 4 set of the professionals that they're involved in this design process. That would be architect, the land planner, landscape architect, and engineer. And engineers are associated with the technology of the built environment. An architect is the one who provides a vision in terms of the layout of the space. And the land planner is the one that look into the site and decide that, okay, where which exact location of this particular site that we are going to put this building on. And think about that, am I going to have the building face toward east or west or any direction? For example, to maximize the natural light to come into the building, and all those kind of things that would be thinking through by the land planner. And then once the site, the exact location of the building is determined, then we have the landscape architect trying to make sure that those space that we do not put on our permanent structure, how the landscape will look like such that we have a nice look and also environmentally sound. So we have those set of professionals work together for this construction. And then we will need to have financing. And financing is a sequence of the activity. First, we need to have a financing for land acquisition and the pre-construction, including the infrastructure for the site, improvement for the site, etc. And then we need to have a financing for construction. And our downtown shopping mall project right now is on hold, and for the reason that the construction financing is not entirely be secured at this moment. So not much, the commitment from development is not entirely there, and so that's the reason why the construction had not been really started. And construction involving a lot of financing, and construction costs a lot of money. And often the case that the traditional financing like equity and the loan from the bank won't be sufficient, still not sufficient for taking on the project, then we will need to have the so-called gap financing. That would be the mezzanine financing with the shares of the ownership, collateral as a security, and like obtaining this type of the debt financing. And then after the construction, the post-construction, so during the stage of our operation, and the financing still need to be there, often in the form of a mortgage. That means that the complete building would be used as a collateral and to obtain financing. Next slide. So in the land acquisition and pre-construction financing, often the case that we may need to involve the acquisition cost for the land and pre-construction cost, including feasibility analysis. Those all cost money. Permitting process, that costs money and time. And so during this particular process, because we are not fully, there's no free cash flow at this moment yet, because we haven't finished our project. So at this stage that the operating risk, business risk is very, very high. We are not quite sure whether we are going to see the final product at this stage. So if we go out to borrow money, the interest rate will be very high. So often the case that we look for the use of option, we look for joint venture, we look for whether they are equity partner to bring down the cost of equity in this particular stage. Next slide. Once we move on to the construction, the business risk become much smaller because you have the permit already. With or without permit make a big difference. After you have the permit, the construction financing tend to involve a relatively lower level of operating and business risk. So in this particular stage that we will need to have financing to cover soft cost and the hard cost. And typically this kind of financing coming from equity and also a bank loan. And so we look for a bank for a relatively short period of the loan, say maybe 1 to 3 years. That will be the length of a typical construction. And this kind of loan often has a floating rate. We're talking about maybe benchmark to LIBOR. Okay, and so this would be the construction financing. After the construction is finished, okay, and often the case that maybe during the construction we still need to have additional loan. That was what we refer to mezzanine debt. Mezzanine debt often has a double-digit interest rate, so this could be costly, and you use that almost like a last resort. Okay, often the case that a lot of developers would try not to use mezzanine financing because it really eat away the profitability of this entire project. Next slide. Post-construction financing often in the form of the mortgage. That means that we use the complete building as a collateral to obtain a mortgage, and this mortgage often has a maturity that is consistent with our expected holding horizon. It could be 5 years, it could be 8 years, it could be 10 years. Okay, and so this is a post-construction financing. And often the case that this post-construction financing coming from banks. And sometimes we may hire investment bank to do the securitization as well. Okay, next slide. And the construction is it takes some time. It could be 2 years, it could be 3 years, and in this particular process, that the developer will need to hire a general contractor. This is usually an engineering company that taking care of the construction issue and task, and the developer will also have a liaison on site, and this liaison representing the developer, we call that construction manager. So the general contractor and the construction manager work together on site to ensure that the vision of the architect and all those planning could be fulfilled according to the specification, and that are in the design. Next slide. And I provide two link here, and those are the two YouTube video. You can copy and paste those links, and you'll be able to watch these two video. These two video are about a new type of construction. We call that modular construction. So that means that the entire building could be break down into multiple modules, and those modules will be individually built in a factory setting, and then once it's completed, bring it onto the site and then assemble on site. And some of those construction techniques are quite beneficial in terms of improving construction quality while reducing the cost of construction. So you may want to take a look at this two video and to have a little bit of exposure on the use of a new construction technology. Next slide. Once the building is almost done, then the marketing would be often handled by a leasing agency. And one example of a leasing agency in the state of Vermont is Redstone. Redstone is one of the commercial property leasing agency, and in the state of Vermont that has a list of the potential tenant, and will be able to do the leasing service for the property owner. Okay, and so that's an outside broker. That one of example of outside broker. Next slide. And then once the property is finished, the tenants start to move in, then we enter the operation phase. And the effective management at this stage during the expected holding horizon of the investor is very important, because a good and efficient operation lead to a greater amount of free cash flow, and in return that improve the valuation of the property for any income generating property. So the ability to operate, it's a very important part of about whether the operator would be able to add value to a property. So today let's stop it here. Next time when we come back, we should be able to finish the rest of this particular topic.